Late in the 19th century, Canada relied on the Royal Navy for any naval protection that would be necessary. And of course, Canada was largely focused on inward. That by the end of the century, the prairies were being populated. The railroad had been built. Industry was flourishing in Ontario and Quebec, et cetera, et cetera. So the focus in Canada was largely inward. However, there was a flourishing fishery on the East Coast and on the West Coast, and so Canada did have fisheries protection cruisers, and then there was interest in having some sort of Canadian naval force. The British government encouraged the larger dominions to establish their own naval forces because particularly after 1900, there was concern about Germany, the rise of the German Navy, and so the Brits wanted to concentrate on what they perceived as a threat, and they hoped that the Australia, Canada would establish their own navies, which would be part of an imperial navy if it ever came to a large conflagration. In 1910, Canada did pass a naval service bill establishing a navy, and we acquired 2 cruisers from the Royal Navy as a corps to be used as training vessels. Rainbow was the one which came out to the West Coast. This is a fantastic model of Rainbow. She again was not particularly modern, but typical of the warships of the time. And we can see that she's got her largest guns fore and aft, and then she's got three single mountings on either side of here in the waist. You can see that she's got several boats. It's interesting that in those days, the warships carried several boats, so if they were in a harbor which didn't have facilities, they could anchor off and get their people ashore, either to pick up stores or in war to do raiding ashore. One of the features of this model that we'll see in the next room is a semaphore. Here on the port wing of the bridge, we can see this little tower-like structure, and when we look at the semaphore, it'll be easier to identify. And likewise, aft, there was another conning position aft with a semaphore, and those were used for signaling at the time. And it's interesting that semaphores were still fitted in British battleships until about 1943. One of the features of Rainbow's armament was a machine gun. This is this is in fact one of her machine guns, so it's kind of interesting that we've got that. Rainbow arrived out here for training, and then in 1914 she was sent out to intercept a German cruiser thought to be coming up from San Francisco. Fortunately, she didn't encounter the German cruiser because she had a scratch crew which had come out from the East Coast at the time. Canada's Navy was still quite small and struggling. The East Coast cruiser Niobe had sent a large part of her crew out in 1914 because Rainbow was going to do a fisheries patrol up in the Bering Sea. So Rainbow went out to intercept this German cruiser. Luckily, that didn't happen. Later on, she made various cruises in the Pacific, on this side of the Pacific, and captured some German merchant ships that had holed up in Mexico when war broke out. Rainbow was then, as the war went on, there was an increasing submarine threat in the Atlantic. And interestingly, German submarines came across to the Western Atlantic, and the Royal Canadian Navy was hard pressed to deal with this threat because the Royal Navy was was unable to send ships over to our side of the Atlantic. So Rainbow was put alongside, and her crew was sent east, again by train, to man up new small anti-submarine ships, which the RCN was pressing into service on the East Coast. After the First World War, there was a big reduction in defense spending, and Rainbow was scrapped. Before she was scrapped, many items were taken off Rainbow here in Victoria, and that's really how our museum has benefited, because a local merchant named Mr. Ret'd's wharf was down on Wharf Street, and there's still the Ret'd building there. Mr. Ret'd came by many of the fixtures. I think he acquired this machine gun, and he acquired the semaphore, and there's a steering wheel next door which came from Rainbow. So that explains why we're the inheritor of these marvelous artifacts. In the corner is a plate from the British cruiser HMS Kent. Now, I mentioned this in 1914, when war broke out, there was a German squadron over in China, because the Germans had a concession in China, just like the Brits had and the French. And so the German squadron set out to return to Germany, and they, in fact, were intercepted off South America by a British squadron, and the Germans handily defeated that British squadron, even though it had a large old battleship, which wasn't terribly effective. And that's kind of noteworthy, because the first Canadian casualties in the Great War were several midshipmen from our naval college. Canada had established a small naval college in Halifax. When these young men had done their basic training, it was time for them to go off to sea. A British cruiser called in Halifax and took these midshipmen on board to give them practical experience. And of course, they had a course of studies to follow. So these guys were aboard when their ship was sunk with all hands by the Germans off Chile in I think it was October 1914. The German squadron then went around to the South Atlantic, and they in turn were intercepted off the Falklands by a British squadron that had been sent out to hunt them down. The British had sent out two fast battle cruisers, and they overwhelmed the Germans, and there was a heavy loss of life. But one of the British cruisers was HMS Kent. She came all the way back around South America to Esquimalt to get repaired, which I've always thought was kind of an interesting example of how bases were so important in our maintaining navies. And so this plate was obviously removed from Kent. Damage had been done by a German shell, and there's a picture of her sitting at anchor in Esquimalt in the background. Okay.